Good day, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's edition of Teneo Insights. I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York City. Relations between the United States and China are unraveling. On May the 12th, the two countries, following negotiations in Geneva, Switzerland, announced a 90-day truce that brought down tariffs from triple-digit levels. Since then, both have accused the other of not living up to the obligations in the deal, and what had started as a tariff-centric trade war is increasingly turning into a supply chain war. Corporate paralysis is only the most apparent collateral damage, with American economic growth, inflation, and interest rates hanging in the balance. Meanwhile, moments ago, Xinhua reports that Presidents Xi and Trump have just spoken by phone at the latter's request, the first formal contact between the two since Trump assumed office. But President Trump captured the mood when he posted on Truth Social earlier this week that President Xi is, quote, very tough and extremely hard to make a deal with. And here to discuss the evolving dynamic in the world's most critical bilateral relationship, the geopolitical and strategic considerations, as well as the economic, I'm joined by two guests. Jude Blanchette is the Distinguished Tang Chair and the inaugural Director of the China Research Center at the RAND Corporation. Previously, he was with CSIS and the Conference Board's China Center for Economics and Business in Beijing. He is widely published and is the author of China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong. Zhu Ning is also with us today. Ning is Deputy Director and Professor of Finance at Shanghai Jiao Tong University's Shanghai Advanced Institute of Finance. He has affiliations with Tsinghua University and Yale, led research teams at Lehman and Nomura, and like Jude, is a prolific writer, including the bestsellers China's Guaranteed Bubble and The Investor's Enemy. Jude and Ning appear today thanks to the efforts of my colleague and frequent guest on this program, Gabe Wildow, and I want to thank them for joining us for the first time. And incidentally, one of you is the 125th guest on this show, so I'll let you two fight it out for who gets the distinction on that. But thanks again for joining. And let's just dive right into it. I mean, we don't have the details yet with regards to this conversation between the two presidents, but obviously, thus far in the Trump administration, the relationship has been dominated by the economic ties and the trade relationship. So maybe Ning, I can start with you. You're joining us from Beijing today. I can start with you and say, what do you think China's strategy for the trade war here is with the U.S.? I mean, on the sort of surface take is that President Trump obviously negotiates via Truth Social and in a very public fashion. Meanwhile, from a Western perspective, of course, Xi Jinping is almost Sphinx-like in the silence. And it's a little bit harder to read what is going on in Beijing. And so, what's your perception on what their strategy is and whether it's working?
Well, I think there are probably a couple of very important pieces of information that one has to keep in mind before we try to understand what China's policy or China's choice of policies are. I think the first thing is, unlike many other countries, this is not the first time that China negotiated with Trump. I think this is quite important to keep in mind. I think part of the reason why so many other countries are negotiating with Trump administration 2.0 is they haven't dealt with Trump before, whereas China has. So I think that's one piece of information we want to keep in mind. And I think the second very important piece of information to keep in mind is China has grown far greater in terms of size, complexity, and in terms of its sustainability with the global supply chain over the past 8 years. So I think that's also a very different perspective to keep in mind before we think about what a China strategy is. So with that, I think China is standing very firm to its ground and stand up to whatever the Trump administration has been asking right leading up to the May 12th announcement. So in that, I think there are probably a few cards. I mean, when Donald Trump said to Zelensky, "You don't have cards," I think clearly China has a few cards up in its sleeves. One is, I think, China is quite resilient with its own economy. I mean, I'm not trying to say that China's economy is not being hit by U.S. export control or tariffs, but China has been trying very hard to dig deeper into its domestic market, also trying very hard to diversify its business into other countries, I mean, such as Mexico and Indonesia. And China is also becoming so indispensable in the global supply chain. So I think in a way, China does understand its importance to the global trade order and financial order. So that's one thing. The second thing is I think China does not feel it will get much out of uh being, I mean, soft or giving in to Trump. I mean, China did that last time, and China has given quite a few of the terms which Trump demanded. I guess the short answer is, one is Trump is not too happy with that. Two is Chinese are not very happy with that either. So I think it doesn't seem to be a very viable or attractive route for China to go double down into, especially given that with everything that China has committed to buy with the first negotiation 5, 6 years ago, there's really not that much for China to go any further with in terms of purchase. Yes, China is very much interested in purchasing all those high value added, high tech exports, which US are exporting to other countries. But then, given the security considerations, I just don't think that's going to happen. So I think China does not have a lot to offer in terms of, I mean, a purchase commitment. So with that, I think China is one trying to flex its muscle, trying to show the states and the rest of the world what it can do to wreak some damage to the U.S. economy. For example, the export control over rare earth. At the very same time, China is trying harder to stabilize its own financial market, its own housing market, and trying to create as many jobs as it can, and also trying to educate its netizens to prepare to live through some tougher period. So I think it's like a 1-2 punch. One is trying to stand up to the U.S. Two is trying to work harder in stabilize its domestic economy. I personally don't think China's economy will be as rosy as before, but then I think China does, in my view, exceed US in one very important area, which is China has greater ability to withstand pain than the US does. So in the era of confrontational challenges, I think that's a very important aspect. I'll pause here.
So, and I just want to follow up here on that last point of, the economic headwinds that the country is facing, because, I take your point with regards to the building of resiliency and the continued efforts that have been made to this sort of self-sufficiency, technological self-sufficiency of the country over the last 8 years and the like. But nonetheless, there's been an economic slowdown. There has been the continued problems with the real estate sector and the like, which I presume does constrain some of the firepower here in Xi Jinping's toolbox. But I do wonder if at the same time, one of the things that many economists have been saying about China is it needs to stimulate domestic demand. And so in a way, does this economic dislocation with the US, is it a blessing in disguise for China in a sense? It forces them to sort of do what they needed to do in terms of boosting domestic demand.
I think my answer would be yes and no. I think conceptually it is very helpful, and it is a blessing in disguise in a way that what it really highlights the importance of domestic consumption to China's sustainable growth. And it is also very important for China to think harder about what if export were eventually to go away, what will be the eventual driving force for China's economy to go eventually lift the GDP per capita into the high income country level around 27, 28,000 US dollar per capita, which is like doubling what China is standing at right now. So I think conceptually it is very helpful. It is actually making it imperative for China to think harder about this. That being said, I think so the lack of domestic consumption contribution to GDP growth is not a limited or isolated problem to China. It has bothered Japan, it has bothered South Korea before, so it is more of a East Asian growth model. It's not just a China model. And for both Japan and South Korea, it took them quite some time to figure that out. I mean, eventually, I think they just I think, bite their time by slowing down their growth, and it take a much longer time to double their growth eventually. I mean, both countries were fortunate enough to eventually break into the high income country threshold, but then China is, I mean, much bigger, and China is also now facing far greater constraints from external. So I think that's a little tricky for China. Even if China is trying to go down that route, the export control from the U.S. or the increasing trade barriers from some other countries, and then also the highly uncertain geopolitical landscape these days, I think is making it harder for China to go down that path of push harder on its domestic consumption. Because ideally, you want to have a nice portfolio of investment, export, and domestic consumption, and the three forces will work together to drive China's economy forward. Sometimes one of them is probably leading, whereas the two other are still working. But then we're looking at a scenario if export were to be severely constrained. We're looking at a scenario in which I think infrastructure is pretty much running to its end. And if export were to be taken out of the formula, it means that domestic consumption would have to single-handedly lift China's economy in the next 5, 10, maybe even 20 years. And that's a little concerning to me in a way about, I think the size of investment and export used to be so big. And without them, I think even the domestic consumption side of the economy will be impacted negatively. So I think that's why I said conceptually it is a blessing in disguise, but in practice, it could bring more trouble than the solutions.
Interesting. Jude, I want to bring you into the conversation here and talk a little bit about U.S. policy here in a moment. But just, listening to what Ning has had to say thus far, and, again, not knowing the details as yet about this morning's call between Presidents Xi and Trump. But do you get the sense that, Ning made this point that Xi Jinping had dealt with Trump, obviously, in the first administration, the first round of the trade war, et cetera. Do you get the sense that that Chinese leadership has got Trump's number in a sense, or do they have an accurate read and therefore are building their strategy around a sound read of this administration's kind of objectives?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, just a few thoughts on how I think both sides are accurately and inaccurately calibrating each other, because I think Chinese have, as Ning just said, the Chinese are not operating on the same playbook they did in Trade War 1.0. They've learned. They've not only learned, but they have developed a pretty expansive set of tools, crucially de jure tools that they're now deploying. So if you look at the legislative and administrative track record of the last 5 or 6 years, it's been a steady progression of Chinese capabilities that are looking to prepare for precisely where we are today. So export controls, counter sanctions laws, unreliable entity lists, all those are in play now, and we're seeing now, especially since over the last 3 weeks, that we're in as much of a export control war as we are a trade war, perhaps even more so. I think both sides, in some sense, underappreciate the strength of the other. It's clear to me that many in the White House overinterpret China's macroeconomic headwinds and think those translate into micro political and economic headwinds, and I just don't agree with that. Ning is nodding, so I assume he sees it the same way. I think there's different flavors in the White House of seeing China as weak. I think there's one strand that looks at demographics, looks at declining GDP growth, looks at the reliance on trade, and sees that as U.S. leverage, right? China, as Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has said several times, we, the United States, buy 5 times more from China than they buy for us. Therefore, we have the leverage because we are their primary consumer. I also think there's some that thought China needed to find a trade deal, otherwise it was going to miss the order cycle for the fall and holidays. and that was going to put significant, unemployment pressure on China's manufacturing sector. And then I think there are those who just see China as structurally weak, and therefore the U.S. could escalate to de-escalate. Essentially, that if it put enough pressure on China, it would get China to break. Conversely, I think the Chinese see the United States as in the weaker position. The Chinese can read the polls. They can read about the unpopularity of the tariffs. They're reading news reports of prospects of bare shelves coming in the summer. And so the Chinese, right after Liberation Day, they were the only country who did not adopt a conciliatory approach. They immediately went tit for tat with the United States. And I should say that tit for tat is actually a different strategy than in the first trade war. In the first trade war, China sort of got up to the line, but was very careful about exactly meeting the United States, worrying about it tipping over into an escalatory spiral. This time around, the Chinese thought that escalation was actually the best de-escalation strategy. So I think both see the other side as in the weaker position, and both have adopted an escalate to de-escalate strategy to some extent. Kevin, just on the call today, what will be interesting to watch is, and it's too early to tell as of 9:20 on June 5th, is what comes out of this, because I think there's likely to be an interpretation today that it was Trump who blinked. You'll notice that the Chinese put in the readout who initiated the call.
Yeah, exactly.
I think the White House will think China blinked, that the escalate to de-escalate strategy worked. We got China to the phone because over the last 3 weeks, the U.S. has put in place, bans on Chinese buying U.S. jet engines for airplanes. We've got the ban on EDA software. We've got the ban on, the potential ban on Chinese students coming in. So what makes this worrying is both sides think they have strategic leverage and that they know the pain points of the other. And that's exactly how we've gotten to where we are today. I think both sides have leverage and think that they're going to get the other side to break.
Yeah, so just on that, I mean, you laid out there sort of the different camps, even within the administration, in terms of their perceptions of China, and yet, one of the hallmarks of this new administration, of course, has been that it hit the ground running on a whole host of areas, but not least of which has been trade, with the reciprocal tariffs against some 200 countries and so on and so forth. And so I kind of wonder, as we have discovered in the UK negotiations and with the China negotiations in Geneva, there's always kind of this question of who has the power to negotiate within the White House, or ultimately, is it all come down to one guy? Meaning, of course, the president. As an analyst, or when you think about the street analysts as an example, I mean, what should they? How should they be forecasting how this kind of plays out? Do you think, or is it really, at the end of the day, it's all about Trump and watch the Trump Truth Social feed?
I think we need to start with a basic assessment of facts. We are 2 months after Liberation Day, and we've had exactly one negotiation. The Chinese, that's with the UK. We haven't started negotiations with the Chinese. All we did on the 12th of May was to simply ratchet back the post-April 2nd, ratchet back and put a pause on an escalating tariff spiral. We have not addressed the underlying April 2nd tariffs, and we haven't gotten into the economic and trade mechanism that the two sides announced on May 12th. So right now we only have 2 months in, one round of negotiations, and you could argue that the UK agreement was not really an agreement.
Yeah, exactly.
So I just, the first premise is any government is constrained in terms of how much it can do at one time. It was already a very ambitious goal to say that the United States was going to, USTR was going to basically negotiate trade agreements, which usually take years.
Yeah.
That we were going to do these with dozens and dozens of countries in a 3-month timeline. I think that assessment that was going to be hard is bearing fruit. We're a month away from either kicking the can again on implementing all of the tariffs, or USTR and the administration is going to have to pull a rabbit out of a hat to get all of this done. I only focus on China, so I don't focus on US-EU trade relations. So let me just say on the China piece, in some sense, what happened on May 12th is both sides got what they wanted to a large extent, and that sort of zapped some of the impetus behind really leaning in on getting that trade and economic mechanism going, right? The Chinese, both sides saw the tariffs as essentially an embargo and wanted to get rid of those. The U.S. had a very clear strategy of saying, we'll ratchet back the tariffs, but we want to see these export controls on magnets out of the way immediately. The next day, BIS announced a restriction on Huawei Ascend chips, which I think Beijing took as being a violation of the spirit of Geneva, and so began slow rolling export licenses for rare earths around magnets. I will be shocked if we can get back to where we were at Geneva. That could be the most optimistic outcome of the call today. Is the Chinese said, look, if you want to get back to square one, which is May 12th, we're going to want to see all of the actions over the last 3 weeks rescinded. I think that's possible. But then where we are is basically back to the very hard equation we had to solve on May 12th, which is over the next 3 months, can these two superpowers who are in a multifaceted strategic competition across a wide number of domains with domestic politics, which are a headwind towards a productive relationship, can they find a way to navigate through all of this and get to some satisfying agreement over the next 3 months? That was hard as it is. If we get through today's call and get back to Geneva, we still have a very steep uphill climb that we're going to have to make.
So just to clarify, I mean, essentially in a way, the U.S. and the administration kind of oversold in a way what was actually accomplished in Geneva. It was more ceasefire, I guess, in a sense, than anything comprehensive. And I think we oversold the UK deal in a sense as well. So these issues that have conspired to lead to this phone call today, the export restrictions on the heavy rare earth magnets and the like, more violate spirit than any actual agreement. It would seem.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's blame to go around on both sides here. I think it's unlikely that Trump green-lighted the Huawei Ascend restrictions, knowing that with a full understanding of how that was going to affect the Chinese calculus. I don't think it was some 4D strategy Trump had to bind the Chinese to Geneva and then salami slice on export controls. I think that just happened incidentally. I think the Chinese have potentially miscalculated in this round of escalate to de-escalate. They have put the U.S. on with the restrictions on magnets, and also, there's been chatter over the last week of concern that the Chinese are going to put restrictions on active pharmaceutical ingredients, APIs. This is even if we get through this skirmish of this call, both sides have learned the larger lesson, which is we should decouple. The Chinese have a calibrated decoupling strategy and have had so for decades. They won't say it overtly, but of course, if you look at the substance of Chinese economic and technological policy since the mid-2000s, and especially since the ZTE and Huawei sanctions of the last Trump administration, China has been building a strategy of resilience and self-sufficiency because they want to strategically decouple from areas where they worry about U.S. leverage. On our side, irrespective of what happens in this current round, I think it is a deep-seated in U.S. DNA now that China has too many control choke points. People knew this before COVID. They knew it during COVID, and it is we've just been reminded of it with the with the battery choke point that China has. So I think I'll end on this, but I think all of us have to basically have two movies that we're concurrently watching. One is the micro movie. Where are we going to be on the tariffs and the export controls on a week to week? And does this get dialed back? And can both sides essentially get back to, frankly, where we were before April 2nd? The second movie is the bigger one. And that's where I think, C-suites need to be having their eye focused on is where is policy going over the next years, weeks? And I think I have a hard time seeing that we're going to come out of this, either side thinking that the recipe for policy is closer integration in technology and investment. I think we're in a divergent strategy.
So I want to come back to that big picture, the second movie and the decoupling concept in a minute. But Ning, just going back to Jude's near-term movie here for a moment. He made a point a little while ago at the outset of his remarks about the U.S. and China kind of feeling they've got a sense of where the pain points were on the other side. And it was pretty clear that the U.S. pain points were made pretty obvious by the performance in the bond market and the dollar market, as an example. But where do you think the pain points are on the China side?
I think probably the following two areas. I mean, one is clearly on the unemployment, especially the unemployment rate for the young people. I mean, that is not confined or restricted to the impact of export control or to tariff restrictions from the U.S. This is a general pattern. I think this is the aftermath of the fallout of the real estate sector and also some of the aftermath of the zero COVID policy. So. And that's in combination with we have an unusually large number of college graduates in the coming decade or so. So I think several factors all coming together. And then, I mean, without potential tensions from the trade war, I think youth employment is already becoming an issue. A couple of years ago, China stopped publishing the employment or the unemployment number for the age group 18 through 25. I mean, they came back and they're publishing that data again a few months ago. But then they're now separating the college students from the people who are not in the college. So I think that's a innovation. But then, I mean, the numbers also seem to improve a little bit, still standing around 17%, 18%, which is alarmingly high. So I think that is one potentially very important pain area. I mean, it's not necessarily such a big blow to the economy. It can be a broader social or political consideration. So I think that's one thing. The second potentially important area is how China is perceived by the rest of the world. I mean, in a way, without the trade pressure or the tariffs, China was working up to Europe to trying to repair some of the relationships as a result of the Ukrainian war. And I think China has made some progress. And China has already become more and more sort of influential or popular, at the very least, among the global South. But then with Trump's strategy of forcing each country to choose a side between China and the US, I think China's original plan may not work as well as it has planned or hoped for. So I think that's another potentially important area for China to deal with.
Yeah, worth noting that while President Trump was in the Middle East recently on a highly publicized trip, at the same time, a number of Latin American leaders, led by President Lula of Brazil, were in China, and President Xi had also just completed a significant tour through Southeast Asia at the time. All to your point. One other thing I wanted to ask you though, Ning, is again, not knowing the outcome of today's call, but basically the reprieve, the 90-day reprieve that came out of Geneva would take us into mid-August. But meanwhile, there's another clock ticking, of course, as well, which is the reciprocal tariff reprieve on most other countries, and that clock is really ticking into early July. And as Jude pointed out, there's been relatively little movement. And one of the things that is now informing the negotiating approach of a lot of countries, and I'm wondering here what China's view on this, of course, is the recent court rulings in the United States, specifically the Court of International Trade here in New York, which essentially ruled against the administration's ability to use to deploy these reciprocal tariffs or to use IEEPA, the emergency authorization, right, to apply tariffs. That has nothing to do with the Section 232 or Section 301 tariffs and the like. But in other words, is there a view of why negotiate against ourselves when the courts might be doing some of the work for us in the U.S.? How is China reading these court decisions in the U.S.?
Well, first of all, I think China, based on my observation, China is really preparing for the worst. So in a way, I think China is already preparing for what if everything goes through. But then, as you mentioned, I think if there's someone in the U.S. or someone within the system that is preventing Trump's from doing what he intended to do or interrupting his original plan. Why stop them? So I think in a way, I think China is waiting for a lot of things to unravel in the U.S. I mean, the same thing applies to the recent ban on student visa at Harvard, or the restrictions on Harvard, on a bunch of other things. So in a way, I think China's message and China's policy is highly coherent and consistent because it's coming out of one single decision maker. Whereas I think, as your question to Jude earlier, I mean, even though Trump has the absolute power within the administration, there's still the Congress, the Supreme Court. So things, whatever he says, is not necessarily final. Whereas in China, whatever President Xi says will be final. So I think there is a little bit of a difference in, as Drew said, about. I think that has a lot to do in how both sides are misinterpreting some of the decision or decision-making process on the other side in a way about, I mean, each side is just so used to the way how things are done within its own country without fully accounting for, well, things are considered, deliberated, and decided in a very different fashion on the other side.
So I want to, over the course of I want to end our conversation on the really big picture, that long-term movie that Jude was talking about earlier. But before we get there, the other element of what informs that policy, there's the economic on the one side, and the other side is security. So in the recent days, we had the annual Shangri-La dialogues in Singapore. Notably, China did not send its typical high-level delegation. But the big news coming out of that event was the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth's speech there. And I think on the one hand, it was a sort of a robust defense of American resolve in the region and standing by allies and the like. On the other hand, it was admonishing allies to step up defense spending, much as the U.S. is in amongst the NATO allies, as an example. But Jude, what was your sense of what the takeaways were there? And particularly again, the secretary's kind of warnings that an action against Taiwan could be more imminent than I think a lot of other analysts perhaps think. What was your sort of view on Shangri-La?
Yeah, so it was the most pointed comment from a defense secretary on the Taiwan issue, although Hegseth was not saying that they had actionable intelligence that the Chinese were on the precipice of an invasion. So that's important to point out. But certainly from Taiwan's perspective, they are desperate for signals from the administration of where they stand on continued support. And so they would welcome, even if there is a bit of a Goldilocks that Taiwan would like to find with statements from the administration. Taiwan wants anything that signals U.S. support and resolve. On the other hand, Taiwan officials will quietly say that banging the drum on war does not help Taiwan in many other ways. If you're a U.S. investor or company or European company investor, where do you put your marginal dollar? If you think that Taiwan is about to be invaded by the Chinese, you don't put it into Taiwan. And right now, Taiwan is facing the problem of many customers of companies, Taiwan and foreign, who operate in Taiwan, being asked to move their supply chains out of Taiwan. So this is a bit of a mixed blessing. I think the second thing that Hegseth said, which was notable, was the call for defense spending to be across the region to be at about 5%. That's not feasible for many Southeast Asian countries. Japan maybe, and maybe by mathematics, you could say Japan is already there, but that is going to be a tough objective for many economies in the region to achieve. The second thing is just realistically, countries in Southeast Asia, especially Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, have a more balanced relationship between the U.S. and China, and are unlikely to mobilize their defense spending and posture at the behest of the United States to rally against China, given both the economic and diplomatic influence and relations that China has with these countries. But I think long story short, I think many in the region, first of all, like seeing a defense secretary come and talk about a commitment to the region. They might want to tweak some of the wording, but there is a real worry, as always is the case, that the United States, while it talks about pivoting to Asia, is continuing to see more resources flow now to the Middle East and to Ukraine. So I think many would take this as a welcome gesture, even if some of the rhetoric they wish they could have adjusted.
So Ning, having heard everything that Jude said, on the other hand, you have President Xi has mandated the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, and its forces to essentially be ready by 2027. Obviously, it's only 2025, but nevertheless, we have seen military exercises becoming more frequent, larger, live fire, more hardware, more crossing of the median line, et cetera, et cetera. How, in your view, should analysts be viewing this level of exercises? I mean, does it suggest that the line between exercise and actual action is going to be harder to discern from further away and with more time? How would you interpret all of this right now?
Well, I think there are two very distinct school of thoughts about this increasing level of activities. One is, as you said, Kevin, I think if you read on the surface, I think the actions is getting more and more active and more and more aggressive. So in a way, this can be construed as a more and more real fire rehearsal of what's going to happen eventually, which eventuated in a hot war. On the other hand, I think at least in China, there's a school of thought which claim that, well, with more and more activities and military trainings and a lot of high pressure actions, it is actually trying harder to keep the separatists at bay in Taiwan. So in a way that, well, this is to give you more and more pressure so that the Taiwan authority does not stand up to say, okay, I want to separate it from China one day, or they raise their voices in that regard. So in a way that is reducing the risk of a more confrontational collision from both sides. That being said, I think there are two things which have changed a lot over the past 3-4 years. One is clearly the Ukraine war, both the way how modern warfare is fought and the way how the West has been helping been hesitant in helping Ukraine with Russia's invasion, and also in terms of how different kind of preparations have to be made to be successful in the war. I think a lot of the calculations have changed. So I think that is one factor that we would have to consider in, well, do China really think it is ready to engage in the war? If it is going to go down that route, will the US really step in as it has always been saying, or with whatever it has been doing with the Ukrainian war, that, well, maybe China has a far better chance in securing Taiwan without US support? So I think that is one big change, or one big piece of parameter which we don't know the answer to. And the second thing is, I think maybe you probably have been following, and I'm sure Jude have been following this quite diligently. There has been a very big sweep of anti-corruption campaign in China's military system. So in that regard, it is a little difficult to imagine how will China be preparing a war with so many senior military officials under investigation, or being arrested, or being detained. So I think that is also something that's probably, even if there was something to be happening, it has to be postponed, because we have to have a more disciplined and a more coherent cadre of army leaders, which are going to be taking responsibility for any kind of military actions.
Jude, Ning brought up the sort of the data point of the Ukraine war on all elements of how that has changed modern warfare, but also obviously President Putin kind of overestimated his military's capabilities, perhaps underestimated the fight that was in the Ukrainians, underestimated how much that bought them in terms of time for the West to kind of get its act together to provide them with some material support. But there's been another interesting data point of late, of course, considering that China has not fought a war since 1979. But the recent the recent hostility between India and Pakistan put modern Chinese weapon platform on display, and it would appear that they performed quite well, particularly late generation fighter jets used by the Pakistani military. What's your sense of how the Pentagon has regarded China's military capabilities, as it has had the largest peacetime military buildup in history, with a naval force now larger than the U.S. Navy, et cetera, et cetera? How is their view of military capability in China now?
I think on the hardware side, there's no complacency about the extraordinary capabilities that China has developed across a number of domains: air, space, sea, cyber, technological. What Zhu Ning mentioned and what you just mentioned, I think, is probably the area where there is some probably the most vexing question for DoD as it tries to assess China's capabilities, which is, you can have all the great hardware you want in the world, but the key question is going to be, how do Chinese soldiers fight in battle? How do these systems operate in the fog of war? You can say China hasn't fought since 1979. That was a relatively small scale border skirmish. Really, the last time China was engaged in large scale combat was against the United States in the Korean War. Then again, the United States has not fought a major war in decades and decades. Arguably Vietnam. So, but I think there are key questions about, as Ning said, we've had this wide-scale corruption campaign within the PLA. We continue to have senior officials at the highest levels be purged. We just had not to rumor monger, but we just had a vice chair of the CMC who was PLA Air Force, who was retired but recently passed away on Monday under circumstances that in any other country you would say were natural, but there has been a phenomenon of senior military officials committing suicide in order to avoid punishment for them and their family. So yes, you have to imagine that the purge going through the PLA is both a cause and a consequence of Xi Jinping's questioning of the combat capability of the PLA. I will just say, though, that for the DoD, I think this is a question of intellectual curiosity. It is not slowing down DoD's concern about and focus on fighting the PLA as if it were a fully functioning lethal force. I think the assessment is it is more dangerous to underestimate the PLA than to overestimate it.
So, guys, I want to end the conversation here coming back to this concept of decoupling, Jude, that you were talking about earlier. And obviously, this idea has been around for a very long time, although it sort of went into a little bit of remission, I think, as we started to think more about de-risking rather than decoupling. But the articulated objectives of the countries seem to be leading us back down this path of a more profound decoupling. And part of the issue here, of course, is that corporate America or multinational corporations over time can prove to be very, very nimble and can adjust to almost any kind of conditions. The issue is how fast this happens and how quickly they are forced to completely reorient supply chains and markets and the like. So I guess the question I would have for both of you is, what do you think the Chinese grand strategy is here? What does it want to be? And how can the United States coexist with that? Or does it need to try to more aggressively contain that? And I ask that question because I want you to sort of land the plane here on how you would therefore characterize what decoupling is likely to look like here over the next few years. Maybe Ning, we'll start with you, and then Jude will end the conversation with you.
Sure, I'll take the first step. I think it is pretty fair to say that the Chinese authority does not seek to project its power too far I mean, I think it's still primarily focusing on domestic issues, domestic economic growth, domestic social stability, domestic political consolidation. So in a way, I think the grand strategy of China, or in China's leaders' mind, is the rejuvenation or the renaissance of China's national glory in the past. So in a way, that is understandable. In a way, some people think, well, that's too grand for other people to feel rest assured. So I think that is probably what China wants. So in a way, China wants to grow its economy, to have greater voices over the world, and to try to have projected an alternative route for the world apart from the capitalism path led by the U.S. So I think that's what I think China's grand strategy is. And in light of that, I think there are probably three important areas of calculations which multinationals would have to consider. I think the first and foremost is probably security and geopolitical. Then there is China's domestic political, and then there is the economic and the business growth opportunities. So when it comes down to, I think, geopolitical or national and military, I think what we just covered about Taiwan is probably the sticking point. So in a way, that is something that we try as hard as we can. We probably still won't have a clear answer at the end of the day. So I think that's something that one should have to hedge, but not necessarily consider that as a high probability event. And political wise, I think China's domestic political scene is rather stable. I think with the 20th Party's Congress behind us, I think, I mean, there is a clear consolidation of power. So as long as I think President Xi stays in power, the political scene is largely steady. We will have a few anti-corruption campaigns or some senior leaders being under investigated, but then in general, I think the general projection of China's domestic economy and domestic political scene is rather steady. I still think the economy is something that the business leaders will have to think harder about. I think I have been advising some global leaders in business in a way about, I think foreign businesses are still a little slow in understanding the fundamental changes that China's economy is going through. I think people understand that China is slowing down, but then they haven't quite understood the depths of the slowdown and the persistency, or to which eventual point will China's long-term growth rate be steady at. In my view, I think it's probably somewhere around 3%, but some people are more optimistic. So that's changing a lot of calculations. China is much bigger than it was a decade ago, which means the size of the market is still quite attractive. But then there are two things which I think foreign leaders have been missing. One is the competitiveness of their domestic competitors. I think China's companies have really come up a long way in its capability in management, in innovation, and in globalization. So in that way, it's not just China is becoming less friendly to foreign businesses. It's just China's domestic players are becoming more competitive, and then I think they deserve some respect in that. And the second thing, which I think people are not fully understanding, is China has grown in a very different model. So I think that the growth, the real estate or credit-driven model, has far greater damage now than it did in any other major economy, and Japan included. So in a way, I think China's moderation will probably take longer, and then the balance sheet recession, so to speak, is going to linger for longer in China than it did with most other countries in the world. So I think that is going to gradually bring the speed of growth down. So I think that is still one factor, in my view, is not fully appreciated or fully understood.
So before we have Jude close us out here, just a quick follow-up though, Ning. One is, do you think that this sort of distorted perception of where China is competitively and economically, et cetera, is that a function to some degree of the fact that that U.S. executives traveling into China have still not recovered to pre-pandemic levels, so they're just not seeing it firsthand, the networks and some of the relationships that they had spent so much time nurturing for decades of successive managements, that those had sort of atrophied over time. Is that part of it? And my second question would be, you talked about, you think that the domestic political situation is stable, and I understand the reasons why you say that. But at the same time, do you think that as Xi Jinping's era in office just continues, I mean, over a longer period where there are fewer competing factions within the close-knit standing committee and Politburo elements of the party, that does the quality of decision making remain as high? I mean, China had always had, because it had this renewal of the leadership every 10 years, seemed to kind of retain this consensual decision making, and that kept them pretty nimble. Is that at risk?
Yeah, the answer to the first is yes. Unfortunately, I think the lack of interpersonal communications from U.S. executives in China and to their Chinese counterparts is really harmful to the U.S. executive and the foreign executives in China in understanding China. And then for that matter, I think the travel advisory from the State Department is not helping for sure. The second is, I think, the quality of decision making. I think that is an excellent point. And then I think that is one point which people are spending a lot of time on. But I think that's also a matter of relativity. I think China may not be making the best decisions it has ever made, but then I think the US is probably doing no much better, maybe worse in that department. So I think it takes two to tango.
Yeah. Jude, same essential question to you, and maybe you could close us out here.
Yeah, I mean, great. Just briefly, I think I think the future extent of decoupling is not a preordained phenomenon. It's going to be an emergent phenomenon as companies and governments both react to what they see are structural trends as well as contingent ones. I think we are in something of a right now a ratchet decoupling, wherein there are decisions being made by boards quietly right now that are functionally speaking about diversification and decoupling that are not public, but are going to be implemented over the next few years and decades. But this also operates in unpredictable ways. You would have seen reporting from the Wall Street Journal yesterday that some companies, in response to the Chinese chokehold over magnets, are thinking about moving more operations into China. So I think anyone who tells you that they know the precise parameters of what bilateral economic and technological interaction will look like is going to sell you a meme coin, because the reality is this is, yes, I think we are no longer in 1995 or 2005, and companies that are not, both Chinese and U.S. companies that are not thinking about diversification, China plus 1, 2, 3, 4 strategies are naive. But on the other hand, I think the easiest thing someone in Washington can tell you is that, the economies are going to diverge and decouple and therefore pull out. And the reality is it's going to be far messier and more challenging than that. So unsatisfying answer, but it's the best one I can think of.
Well, as our regular audience knows, China-U.S. relations, geopolitically, strategically, economically, it's been a recurring subject, and it will continue to do so. It's simply the most important bilateral relationship of the 21st century. We will continue to follow these stories as they develop. Meanwhile, I want to thank Zhu Ning for joining us late tonight. Really appreciate it, and Jude Blanchette as well. Thank you both for joining us. We will be back soon with the next edition of Teneo Insights. Meantime, I'm Kevin Kajiwara in New York. Have a great day. Thanks again.